Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Zach, and I am an INFP.
I am Mauricio, and I am an ENTP. And today we are going to talk about misconceptions in MBTI, which there's a lot of. I think if you are interested, towards the end, we will be talking about our own type journey and why we're making this podcast. But for now, we just want to go ahead and kick it off and start with the misconceptions. The number one misconception is that your Myers-Briggs type explains your personality. So, Zach, do you want to kick us off there?
Yeah, I think that's a good starting place because whenever anyone thinks of the Myers-Briggs, thinks of the MBTI, usually the first word that comes to mind is going to be personality. And I think, however, we're defining personality is going to depend on what kind of test we're using. So with the Myers-Briggs, um, I would say what it does really well of measuring is going to be how we go in the world and learn about things. How do we get data? What information are we working with? What have I seen today that will influence my choices later on in the day? That's one thing I think the test measures really well. And it does that by looking at the differences between intuition and sensing. And of course, throughout the course of this podcast and many more episodes, we will go way into detail about what these things mean. So that's one thing I'd say. The second thing that the Myers Briggs does and explains about us as people is how we actually make decisions once we have data. So it's great that we've collected data from the world. We're all little scientists doing our daily experiments of life. But once we have that information, what do we do? And the Myers Briggs goes about answering that by defining people as either thinking or feeling, which it just uses as two different ways of making decisions. Do you make a decision based off of more how you feel about a thing or what you logically know about a thing? Again, there's way more complicated nuance to it than that, but to just sum it all up, I'd say what the test does is it tells you how you go around the world and do things. It doesn't necessarily say anything about who you are as a person. It's more so what's happening in here and how what in here translates to out there.
Yeah, to add on to that, it's your cognition, right? It's not your personality, and it's how cognition is interpreted based on Carl Jung's cognitive functions, and because personality is like pretty varied, and two people with different cognition could in some situations have similar personalities, right? But the way that they're thinking and the way that they're processing information, learning, collecting data, whatever, could be very different than how they're acting in that moment, right? So um, I think people always conflate these things with this is how you act and this is how you are. And it's like, I'm totally this personality. And it's like, well, not really. There is a correlation between like how you act and your cognition, but it's really not so cut and dry, I think, in my opinion.
I think that when you look at the Myers Briggs from the framework of there being 16 personality types, 16 different combinations of those four letters, I think what those 16 types represent are different ways that people have been throughout history. Because for each type, if you were to describe the stereotypes of a type, the things that you think of as just generally what defines an ISFJ, what defines an ENTP, what defines an ESTJ, we all have our own opinions, and then there's some that are going to be shared, right? Some people will have common opinions about these things. Well, I think these types are just representing there's always been people who act in a certain way. You've always, throughout all of history, there's always been people who are going to be a little more neurotic. There's going to be people who have been super go with the flow and, maybe they procrastinate and get things done at the last second. These patterns of behavior, they're not unique. They're not new. They are shared across time. And I think what the Myers-Briggs does is just show where do we, as people living in 2024, fit into that framework because we're
Yeah.
part of this human race that's been going on for a while now.
No, totally. And I think we'll go into more detail regarding like the actual functions within the type like later on. But really more than anything, it's a cognitive preference as well, right? So
Mhm.
like there's your conscious functions, and your functions are ordered in a certain way, and the way that your functions are consciously oriented and the order that they're in are going to dictate the magnitude of your preference, right? But that doesn't mean like if you have a preference for Chinese food over Mexican food, that doesn't mean that you're never gonna want Mexican food or you're never gonna eat it, right? So it's more so a preference than anything completely definitive, as well.
Preference is a great word for it because with these types, we talk about our letters. So for me, INFP, and even just from the basic starting out, I introvert. I'm an introvert, and I am, and that's absolutely my preference. I like engaging with the world in my head a
Mm-hmm.
lot more than I like engaging with the world outside of my head. But that
Ooh,
doesn't mean I don't. What was that?
this is a spicy lead actually into the next misconception. So I
Yeah,
might
it is.
actually just go ahead and bridge that here. What does it actually mean to be introverted versus extroverted? So I think you were kind of touching on this a little bit. So you can just keep going, and I've got some things that I want to tack on there as well.
Absolutely. I think there's the idea of engaging with thoughts in your own head really is the crux of introversion, whereas extroversion is how are you engaging with the world. And really, anytime I mean the world, I'm just saying anything that's not in your head. Even this space right in front of me is the world. I'm
Yeah.
This is no longer my brain here. This is now air in front of me. When
Yep.
Carl Jung first wrote psychological types and defined the differences between extroversion and introversion, that's where he actually started with it. That was the first difference he noticed. Um,
Yeah.
Jung wrote about different conversations he had with Sigmund Freud and Alfred Adler, two other famous psychologists of the time. And Jung noticed that with Freud, a lot of his theories were based off of how are people engaging with things out in the world? How is their relationship with their mother? How is their relationship with their father? All these external factors. Jung noticed that Freud really cared about the external, whereas Adler's theories, we don't need to go into detail with them, but I'd say the idea from Adler that most people know, even if you don't have any psychology training, is is the idea of the inferiority complex. Is comes from Adler. This idea of like, oh, I'm I feel smaller than you for whatever reason, whether it's intellectual or financially or whatever, and I get
Mm-hmm.
a stick up my ass about it. Um, and that's the inferiority complex that Adler talked about. Well, all of that is happening inside, right? That's your own head. You're having these thoughts of like, oh, well, this person has these things that I want and I don't have them, and all the negative thoughts that go along with that. But Jung noticed, well, Adler cares more about what's going on inside.
Mm-hmm.
Noticing those differences between the two is where he first started writing about introversion and extroversion is just literally just being different ways of going about things. Are you going about it based off of what's out there, or are you going about it based off of what's in here?
Yeah, so it doesn't mean that you can't talk to people or you're social, not social, whether you get energy from other people. It's like, oh, people drain me. That means I'm an introvert. It's like, well, maybe, or maybe you're just around the wrong people, right? That drain you a little bit. Those are the misconceptions I've heard the most, right? Like I've tried to type people before, and all of their cognitive functions maybe line up with something with like their first function being extroverted. Um, but they're like, oh, but I like to spend a lot of time alone. And and it's like, well, it doesn't mean that you don't like to spend time alone. It just means that your primary goggles for seeing the world are extroverted, right? So how Carl Jung talks about it is he basically refers to the object, and the object is the external world, right? So it's basically like things, people, or actually like objects outside of you. It's like anything, like Zach said, anything that you can see like outside of you, right? And pure extroversion, it looks to that object as the rule, like the rule of the land. It's objective. There's no barrier between the outside world and its perception. With introversion, think of it like there's you. If you're an introvert, right? There's you, there's the outside world, and then between you guys, there's a wall of subjectivity. And that wall of subjectivity is basically forming some type of opinion or some type of feeling or some type of judgment about the objective world, right? And we both types, objective and subjective, have the counter type, right? Nobody's completely objective and nobody's completely subjective. But the lens through which you see the world can be primarily subjective or objective. And I want to harp on this too, because I think in the words that we normally use, objective means like accurate, and subjective means like maybe emotional or like my opinion. And that's kind of true. But in this context, it just means objective is the world without any subjective understanding of it. Without your own opinions, your feelings, whether logical or not, placed on top of it, right?
I think of it almost like you're walking through the woods and you see a tree that's just laying across. It's fallen and it's on the ground. And if you see that, well, that's all you've seen. You have seen a tree that's on the ground. That's it. That's the object. But the subjective piece, I think, can come in, and maybe I start telling myself, someone must have chopped this down, or maybe it got struck by lightning, or maybe, X number of things could have happened. All of these, I don't know any of them to be true. They're just my own experiences, things I've learned to be true, and I'm applying my own knowledge in my head. I'm not changing anything about the situation. The tree still lays there, but for me, I've created this world in my head. And I think that is one of the key parts of introversion. That wall that you're talking about in between the object and ourselves creates a bit of a buffer for the introvert to live in their head, because they have that space. You've created it for ourselves.
Yeah. No, I like that example. And it makes me think of an example that Jung used in Psychological Types, which you might have seen, where he's basically like, okay, it's cold outside, right? So a very extroverted person would let the objective world define their subjectivity, right? So in this case, it's cold outside. The world is telling me I need a jacket. There's no judgment. There is almost just a reaction from the objective world. Whereas an introvert, again, wall of subjectivity in between the self and the objective world. So they might be like, the objective world is telling me that it's cold outside, but jackets are for pussies. I'm not going to wear a jacket because I want to test myself. I don't think Jung used the word pussy in particular. Maybe he did, but not in this book. But the point is, there's a judgment. There's a judgment there.
Have you read that book?
Not yet, bro. That's next on the list.
First word in the book.
Yeah, right. No, but that's the point, right? It's like there's an internal subjective judgment on what the objective world is immediately telling you, right? If you just listen to the objective world and had no judgment, then, you would likely be an extrovert. And how much you listen to the objective world over subjectivity kind of can define your scale of extroversion. And there's more that goes into that, right? Like, when you talk about like if you're super objective, meaning you're super extroverted consciously, right? Your subconscious will flip, and your subconscious is actually very subjective, and vice versa. But I think we can probably address the conscious and subconscious probably in another episode.
No, no, I don't think that's that important. One thing we can just gloss over that.
Okay. Oh, fuck me then. Was that a joke?
It was very much a joke.
Okay, I was gonna say, bro, are you fucking kidding me?
Yeah, episode 1, I just tell you, I'm actually really not that interested.
Yeah, bro, I actually quit. Like,
Yeah.
I'm done. Like 19 minutes in, like,
Yeah.
this shit doesn't make any sense.
I'm sorry, I'm too introverted to be doing this. I need to go back to my.
Yeah, you gotta go recharge your batteries a little bit.
Exactly.
That's funny. Okay. Do you have anything else to add on that topic of introversion, extroversion?
I would say I think there is a tendency for some elements of some types to be favored in the typing community. I think there's preference paid to a lot of, for example, intuitive types. I think there's preference given towards thinking types.
NTs, bro. NTs
Those
think
NTs,
they're they're the best, and I'm an NT,
and
and I do think I'm the best, but
for
no,
sure.
no, but like they're the best. Everything's contextual, right? Like they're the best at what? Like that would be what I would say. Like it really depends.
I think despite the fact that there's those types that do, get the praise and get the plaudits from others, the idea that having a subjective worldview, it will definitely get shit on. But I think there's always a need for both, right? Objective and subjective are needed for a complete picture. And then the last thing I'd say on that is just for us to keep in mind, while we as people have our objective understanding of the world, and we use our tools like science to get to that place of understanding, we're also limited in our scope, right? The classic example is the light waves that we can see. We only see a tiny fraction of the entire light spectrum. So what we're deeming as objective reality, sure, but you don't necessarily know that that's the full picture. And that's it's not to say question every single thing ever, but it's definitely something that I think can be just, something to keep in mind.
No, definitely. Now, what I would add on to that is kind of going back to your point about there's some preferences, right? People think there's some type of like intuitive supremacy or preference or thinking preference and supremacy. I think that brings us to misconception number 3, which is that feelers are super emotional and irrational, and thinkers are just like these super objective, logical robots, right? And this makes especially guys not talk about or want to be feelers. But this is not the case, right? This is a misconception. Everybody has emotions, and everybody has logic. It's just a matter of preference. So let's dive into that a little bit as well.
For me, leading with introverted feeling, yeah, that is going to be the thing that I use most in my day-to-day experiences. But my extroverted thinking is still there, and it still has inputs. Now, obviously, it's not going to be as strong of input being at the very bottom of my function preferences, but that doesn't mean it's not relevant. And I think whatever your last function is, even if it's one that you feel like you don't engage with a lot, that could be a sign to like, hey, maybe think about that one a little more. What does that look like? What is living the world through that lens look like? That's not saying you need to completely change, but just try it out, see what happens.
Yeah. No, definitely. And I mean, you're gonna use it, right? Because like, okay, you as an INFP, you use a lot of introverted feeling, but when you're engaging with the outside world, like say you're working on something that requires some type of execution, like you're gonna rely on your NE and you're gonna rely on your extroverted thinking. And so you have to develop your last function because otherwise you're not going to be very effective in the outside world. Like you're not going to know how to fully interact with the world in a way that's productive. So for you, right, it looks like developing your extroverted thinking so that it's not a crutch. Like it's actually something you can like essentially rely on, right? I don't think it'll ever be as strong as your FI because those are your goggles for the world, right? That's like how you see things. For me, it's a little different, right? Because as an ENTP, the thinking and feeling functions are actually right next to each other in the middle, right? So one of them, again, being introverted, which is the introverted thinking for me, and one of them being extroverted, the extroverted feeling. And so with types like that, you'll see a lot of context switching between, there's a very quick back and forth between feeling and thinking, feeling and thinking, feeling and thinking. So I think for us, it's easier to maybe develop both the thinking and feeling functions because of their positioning. But then, that comes with the trade-off of struggling with a perceiving function. Or would that be a judging function?
Are you talking about
SI?
your introverted sensing? That's going to be perceiving.
That's right. That's right.
And I think that's a good point. Thinking about your last function, your introverted sensing. I mean, like you said, for me, I need to develop that extroverted thinking, that final function, because I need to learn more about how to engage with the outside. For you, your last function being introverted sensing, that means there's a call for you to learn how to better navigate your internal world. Like that is what doesn't come as naturally for you, at least in the sensing mode. That's still, and I think, I know you, like no one listening to this does, but I know you, and I know that you have a really bad memory for like mundane little things, like small detail kind of things, like, oh, did I remember, where'd you put your phone, where'd you put your keys, did you take your medicine, like little
Did I remember to feed my kids?
exactly small
No.
sensory details that don't matter.
Yeah. Did I pick up my kids from school last week? Fuck.
Yeah, right.
They're still there. Yeah, no, exactly. Like I really struggle with organizing things, sensory things from the outside world. But I don't struggle with the intuitive side of the outside world. It is very easy for me to organize things that are intuitive, that come to me, that are around me, right? So again, just a preference that I think is obvious, and as we get older, we kind of start to develop the other sides a little bit more.
Well, and that's just the journey of life, right? If we come into the world with 4 functions, ideally we leave the world with access to 8.
Yeah, 100%. Got to access those shadow functions, man.
Ooh, the shadow is definitely deserving of its own, not even just episode, but series of episodes.
Oh my god, yeah, 100%, man. I'm just getting into like reading about the unconscious
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's crazy. It's very interesting. But okay, so jumping back into our misconceptions, I wanted to go to judging specifically because something that I've heard a lot about the MBTI community are people saying like, "Oh, I'm judgmental, therefore I'm a judger," or "I'm not judgmental, therefore I'm not a judger." And what do you have to say about that? Because I think that's hogwash.
You know,
I never use that word. I don't know why I used it right now.
but it must
But
mean you really feel a certain way.
dude, it means my gears are grinded at the moment for sure.
Yeah, and understandably so. I mean, I think the judgment piece of the MBTI is, well, originally, it is referring to that decision making process. How do you make your judgments off of data? So, in that sense, it's just decision making. But on another level, something that I think comes up a lot. So for the listeners who don't know me, I am in training to get a PhD in experimental psychology right now, and
Dude, we
part
should have
of
said
that
that in the beginning.
I probably should have,
That's
but 34 minutes in, hey.
that's it,
And
man. But
exactly, and part of getting a PhD in psychology involves reading having a basic understanding of literature across the field. When you look at the personality literature right now, a lot of what has been coming out, so the personality field of psychology has used the Big Five model for quite a while now, and it's for good reason. It's a pretty robust and pretty good model at explaining people, with five personality traits: conscientiousness, agreeableness, emotional stability, openness to experience, and extroversion. And those five traits definitely have some degree of overlap with the MBTI. And I bring it up here because the idea of judging, being a judging type, where you're primary, like a J, as in J being your last letter, I'd say when you look at the actual items on the tests that, like the MBTI tests or any, the official one or free ones, the questions that will get you a J are usually items that correlate pretty highly with conscientiousness on the Big Five. They're items like I prefer to plan something out way ahead of time as opposed to winging it last minute. Or I like to go on vacation and just wander the city versus I like to go on vacation and have an exact schedule of every minute while I'm there. And the J, I think if we're going to label it as like a quick cheesy one-off thing, instead of judgmental, I'd say a better label for it would be practical, future thinking, conscientiousness.
yeah, I think referring it back to or relating it back to the Big Five, like it does correlate pretty well with conscientiousness. From an MBTI context, I would say an easy way to determine one over the other is speed of decision making as well. So, like perceivers, right? If you're a P on the test, your preferred mode of engaging with the outside world is data collection, right? Like you prefer collecting data for as long as possible before making a decision because that's what that's what gives you energy. That's what's easy. That's your preference is
Mm-hmm.
data collection. Whereas judgers, right, the J in the MBTI 16 personalities, whatever, it's actually making a judgment on the data. So making some type of decision, right? So what you'll see with like say an ENTJ is they will definitely connect external data, but they will collect external data to make a decision to get something moving. And as soon as they have enough data that like enough data that their extroverted thinking determines is enough to make a decision, they would just make a decision. They're not enamored with the process of data collection. Whereas for me, right, as an ENTP, that's like the most fun thing. And types types where data collection is a really fun thing, like they might struggle with decision making, or they might procrastinate decision making.
I do.
Because yeah, it's not as fun. It's not as fun to make judgments on data. It's just fun to collect and organize it. So I would say in the MBTI context, that's also super relevant. It's just, how do you make judgments, aka decisions, on data collection?
I think your statement just a second ago described your type really well. You said, what's fun is collecting data and organizing it, but not making decisions. In that sentence alone, I feel like you managed to say extroverted intuition, introverted thinking, introvert sensing, and extroverted feeling. Well, maybe not the FE, but like you said, like it's fun to collect data, right? That to me sounds like an extroverted intuitive process. You're going out and collecting data. You are making connections in the world. Then you said you like to organize it. That's your introverted sensing. You want to do something with it. You don't want to just collect it and throw it away. You want to collect it and catalog it. Because maybe it'll be used
I
later.
spend so much time. Yeah, I spend so much time like journaling or making lists about like writing out frameworks or like tweaking frameworks in Notion or something, that I have about different topics. But then yeah, I'll struggle to make a decision. So it is kind of funny, right? Whereas like I see with some people, they don't do that organization really at all. Like they don't spend time cataloging. They just decide and move, right? I have a lot of ENTJ friends. Like I have a lot of friends in the startup world and things like that, and they don't. I don't want to say they don't think about things, because they do think about things a lot, but they just think about them in a different context. Like, how do I get this done? What decisions and what has to happen for these things to get done? It's not so much about organization; it's a lot more about execution. And that's very interesting to me to observe.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
I think, and I noticed with you, right? Like as an INFP, you also you collect a ton of data, but it's just immediately cataloged by your FI and your SI. So you always have a catalog of outside collections that has been through your FI filter. But whenever it's time to act on it, like, and be super quote unquote conscientious about it, like that might be a little difficult, right? Especially if it's something that FI doesn't value. If it does value it, then it's a lot
Then
easier.
no problem.
Because,
Yeah, just go ahead and do it.
Right.
That's fine. Yeah.
right.
Being an FI lead and not wanting to do something but having to do it is really annoying. I gotta say, I don't like it for me, and I don't like it for people around me. I'm like, I get it. I think it's annoying too that I don't want to do this thing, and I'm being kind of a shit about it. Well, it's because if I could change how I feel about a thing like that, I would, but it's being an FI lead, it feels like such an intense thing. It's like I cannot change how I feel. That is literally my first thing that I do, is make that feeling decision about whatever it is.
Yeah, which is like funny, right? Because like if you talk to an FI inferior person, like you talk to an ENTJ, ESTJ, they're gonna be like, "Well, fuck what you feel," right? Like, who gives a shit if you want to do the thing or not? Like, the thing has to get done. And in some contexts, they're right, but their mental cognitive process is entirely different, right? That would, like, them asking you to do that is like you asking them, fuck what you think about it. Like, just sit there and feel the things that you need to feel. Like, have your subjective process. Like, they'd look at you like you're like crazy, you know? Of course, there's context, like, there's situations where they are correct and you should probably do the thing. But there are also contexts where you would be correct, right? Again, I've helped a lot of my ENTJ friends with relationships. And maybe they should spend, in the personal life side of things, a little bit more time with their FI. It would help them with a lot of problems that they have. But asking them to do that sometimes is like pulling teeth. So it is hard. It's a completely different mental framework than they're used to. They're not used to consciously and willingly spending a lot of time there.
Well, and I think that's a good point. The idea of how do we engage with a function that is not part of our preference, a function that's not one of our four primary ways of going about things. I had a conversation earlier today with my fiance, who she is an INFJ, and her extroverted feeling is so strong in so many contexts and situations where so many of the decisions she makes out in the world are, how do the people around me, how do they value this thing? So therefore I can make my decision based off of that. She does that so much, and she does it really well. But at the same time, I think that can lead to situations where if you care so much about what others are feeling, you're going to start to neglect your own desires, your own feelings, your own wants. And I told her today, or she was telling me a story actually about a time where she disagreed with her family on something, with some members of her family. And she explained to them, to whoever she was talking to, all of the things that she cared about on the particular situation. All she did was express how she felt, what was important to her, why the context mattered for her, and that was it. She left it at that, and told me that afterwards, everyone that she talked to was like, "Hey, you know what? You're right," and they ended up supporting her in that situation. But when she told me that story, I told her, I was like, "Hey, think about what you did there. You engaged in an introverted feeling. You engaged in your FI. Like, you looked at, hey, what matters to me? What do I care about? What have I decided is important? And you let that be what drove your decision, not what other people feel." And I know she
Look
was
at her using her unconscious.
Exactly. And like, that's uncomfortable. Of course it's uncomfortable using your unconscious. Like, that's why we don't use it. Like, it'd be wild to use it all the time.
Yeah, no, totally. Totally. And that's, I mean, Jung talks about that, right? Like, the more you use the objective, the more you neglect the subjective, right? So when he
Mm-hmm.
talks about types that are super objective, so on like the highest end of extroversion, a lot of times he mentioned hysteria, and he mentioned how
Mm-hmm.
really extroverted objective types, they may become hysteric, like, because they essentially they either might become hysteric, or they might develop actual physical conditions, like a physical illness or something that is actually wrong inside of them, to basically it's like their mind trying to force equilibrium. It's like, hey, stop engaging with the outside world for a little while, because you need to create some level of homeostasis,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is very interesting. And you neglect the other side by leaning too far into the other. And I think what Hannah did there is cool. Like, her preference is, is I think she leads when it comes to other people. She is very objective, objectively focused, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes she needs a little subjectivity because yeah, you can avoid your subjective self in those
Absolutely.
contexts a lot. And I'm the
The
opposite, right? Like I have those functions that Hannah has, except like, and it's TI before FE. So I make a lot of subjective self value judgments a lot before thinking about the group.
hmm
So my growth has been more so about thinking about the group a little more, like my family, or I guess just the broader group in general when making decisions or making judgments. Okay, so now we're going to wrap up the MBTI misconceptions, and we're going to talk about our specific type journeys and what we're doing this podcast for. So we'll start with Zach because, as Zach mentioned, he is an INFP, but for a very, very long time, those that were close to him, me included, his fiance Hannah included, we thought he was an ISFJ, and he thought that as well. So, Zach, do you want to explain that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it gets back to the idea we talked about earlier. These types are representing historical forms of like ways people have been throughout history. So the ISFJ type, what goes into that, I think a lot of that I can see it in myself, and I still do now. But this idea of how did I make this decision to switch calling myself an ISFJ to an INFP was actually a conversation between me, Mauricio, and Hannah, and Hannah mentioned, she just said, Zach, I feel like you don't have very strong opinions on things. And she's like, and I don't mean that in a bad way, more so just that you don't tend to get very like stuck in an opinion. You'll change it if you feel like that's necessary. And I said, I think you're right. And ironically, we're like going back to this idea of J is judgment. Um, but kind of from thinking about that of like, well, you don't seem like you're like really sticking to like making these snap decisions. You like going back for more data all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so from that, we're like, well,
Are
maybe
you a
I'm,
perceiver? Are
maybe
you
I'm,
coming out as a perceiver?
maybe ISFP, but that doesn't sound right. I'm like, again, not to
Yeah.
overly stereotype our types here, but I'm not an artist. I'm not an athlete. Like I
No,
don't,
no. Well. So what I will add to that, stereotypes aside, is this man has no extroverted sensing.
none
So
whatsoever.
I like it for the INFP. It's literally their blind spot, right? Like they're SE blind, and I was like, okay, that makes sense. You have very little SE, um, and you definitely like you have a lot of NE, and it was very obvious. I think Hannah was right in bringing up that you're a collector more than anything else. Um, but then I think there's a mimetic side to it, right? That we didn't bring up, where it's like you grew up in an SJ household, right? Like your mom is an ISFJ, your dad is an ESFJ,
I
and
think he's an ISTJ, but that's just me.
oh, okay, well SJ regardless.
Yeah.
So ISFJ and ISTJ, and it's like as a kid, I feel like most kids when they're young, they go one of two ways, right? They go the rebel side where they try to be as different from their parents as possible, or they go the mimetic side and they behave as much like their parents as possible. And I don't think those things are conscious. I think they just happen. And I think I went maybe a little more on the rebel side. You went a little bit more on the mimetic side. And you acted more like an SJ person. But the more time that you spent away from your childhood home, the more we were able to split hairs and realize, like, hey, maybe the way that Zach processes stuff is that of an INFP. Like, he definitely uses a lot of FI. I have seen this guy multiple times just completely do something different than the group. Which I'm not saying the ISFJ can't do. I think they can do it, especially if they really believe in something or they're trying to defend someone or whatever, but it's not something that they're comfortable with doing enough to where it's a defining characteristic of them. And for Zach, like, him doing his own thing is a defining characteristic. Like, when I met this kid in elementary school, like, he was weird as fuck. He would bring his like pet like his little pocket monkey to school.
Yeah.
Like yeah, you could have gotten bullied for it. Maybe you should have gotten bullied for it, honestly. No, just kidding. But like my point is, like, he just like did what he felt like doing, and it didn't really matter to him that if it came off as weird to other people, right? And it was something that I really respected, because I am also an individualist, but I do also have the extroverted feeling side. So it's like, yeah, I want to go my own way, but there is a side of me that very strongly cares about public perception. So the fact that this dude was able to like go into things and literally not give a flying fuck, like, that was very interesting to me. So I don't know how I missed that. I don't know how I missed that as I was so confident that you were an ISFJ, but just going back in time, it was like so obvious.
I think the thing is I really do act in a lot of the more stereotypical ISFJ ways, and I think a lot of that is like we're saying, it's me looking to see what does my mom do in situations like this, what does my dad do in situations like this, and just
When you do use a lot of SI, right?
I do.
So that is SI.
I grew up with two people who that was their dominant function and still is their dominant function.
Right, right.
It's funny, the day before we had that conversation of switching me from ISFJ to INFP, I was in Washington D.C. with some friends.
Yeah.
We were at the Smithsonian, and everyone in the group is like, "Hey, let's go check out the Natural History Museum." And I'm just like, why? There's natural history museums everywhere. We're in Washington, D.C. Let me go see the American History Museum. This is the capital of the U.S. That's what matters here.
Let's go.
I took Hannah and I said, hey, let's go to the War Museum. And she said, okay, sure. And we left the group and we spent the whole time at the Smithsonian on our own doing that. And I was just like, yeah, I don't it wasn't even like thinking about how's everyone going to feel about this was not even close to part of my decision making.
I'm sure it was part of hers.
It definitely was. And
yeah.
For me, unless it's at a point where I'm like, am I being an asshole about this? Like, am I actively hurting other people by doing this? Other than that, no, I'm just going to do what feels right. And I think that is, it's introverted feeling. That's me. That's mine. And of course we can go forever on that too. But I think with you, we came to the conclusion on you being an ENTP quite a while ago.
Yeah.
But I think you definitely have had a lot of, I don't know if struggle is the right word, but a lot of consideration and tinkering on it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, one thing I'll say about that too. Well, one of many things, but the first thing is like, I have gotten typed a few times, like just like influencers in the space, like paying them money to see what they think my type is. Literally just out of curiosity. Like, I was just curious what their business process was in doing this and then how they approached the typing. And it's funny, like, I've gotten a ton of different types. And when I started getting typed, it was a lot of thinking types, and the more recent ones are like more feeling types, which is kind of interesting. But they all typed me as an EP type. So I've gotten the ESTP, I've gotten the ENTP, I've gotten the ESFP, and I've gotten the ENFP. So I've gotten all four. I also got INTP one time, but for the most part, it's been on the EP spectrum. And I think a lot of the reason why, and why I even considered like ENFP, I didn't really like. I kind of considered ESFP. I just think I have too much NE,
I
which
agree.
so like you can even see it in like how I talk. Like I feel like I just like jump from thing to thing when I'm like actively talking, right? So it's like there's an element of that. But also I think the only one I considered between like the feeling EP types was the ENFP, because like I do think at least now I am more in touch with the feeling side. Like I've done a lot of like inner work, I guess, for lack of a better
Hmm.
term. And I think for people in this space, like the fact that I do inner work and I'm very self-aware and I'm aware of how I feel, um, it's like counter to a lot of perceptions about what being an ENTP means. But I would say that like the fact that I'm aware of feelings, the fact that I understand myself better and I'm more considerate, like I mean I don't think that means that I necessarily use introverted feeling. Like I think that I've just matured. I've done a lot of work to understand these things. And I do think, which maybe you can give more context on, that like FI blind kind of still bites me in the butt a lot. So I think that's kind of been like my approach to it. And I still see I almost see like too much FE to think that I'm an ENFP.
I would agree with that. I think for whenever we're trying to come up with someone's type, I think one of the best ways to do it, if you're not entirely sure, is think about like, hey, what based off of, based off of the different types, like where do you see someone's blind spot being? I think that's a good marker of giving you an idea. It doesn't exactly tell you, but it's a good idea. And for you saying you're FI blind, blind spot of introverted feeling, I think you can see that in a lot of situations, like if you're in a job that you don't really want to be doing anymore for whatever reason, maybe you're tired, I don't, who knows, but you've had times where you'll kind of go back and forth and wrestle a lot with your what matters to you. Like, do I want to do this or not do this? And it's an internal feeling process. Like only you know on the inside what you're feeling. But I think it being a blind spot in you can kind of just make it take a longer time for you to see it. Even if it's right here, it's kind of
Dude,
like
it's
huh?
it's
What?
the most stressful thing like
Yeah.
possible. Whenever someone asks me to like, well, like, how do you feel about like what, like when asking what decision I should make, it's like, well, how do you feel about it? It's like I don't really know. I mean, I know that I feel upset. I know that I feel stressed. I know that I
Yeah.
feel overwhelmed. But in terms of like how I want to approach this thing, I don't know. And it's like, even if I know, right? Because there are some moments of lucidity where I'm like, okay, I'm excited about this. Like 10 minutes later, I'll be like, so what? Like, that doesn't mean that it's a good decision. And I'll just like keep going back and forth. Um, and like, you could argue that like a TI Ox wouldn't think about the value judgments, like the FI part of the equation at all. They think a combination of like the inner work that has been done plus making the mistake too many times of not checking in,
Mm.
have kind of taught me that I have to check in to an extent. Um, so yeah, I totally, I mean, I totally agree with that there.
And I know we're running short on time. I'll say one more thing here for me. That idea of checking in with yourself. I love that because that is not type specific. That has nothing to do with what your type is. That's something that we literally all need to do just regularly. And that's not even me
Yeah.
being a psychologist saying that. That's just me being a person. Like we need to do that. Otherwise, we have no idea what's going on with ourselves. And
Mhm.
these types, to put a bow on it, the one of the common misconceptions being these types explain everything about you, and that's what we're trying to do. We're not. It's simply just a series of observations that have gone together that explain some behaviors within people. There's still so much more complexity to us. There's so many other factors at play, that yeah, this is just one piece of that puzzle.
No, I totally agree. We're just mainly talking about cognitive preferences, and that's really
I
the
love
main
talking
thing.
about cognitive preferences.
um, okay, so last thing, which we'll make it quick. I know it's kind of a longer podcast. Is just why we're making this podcast in the first place, and we didn't want to give it its own episode because no one cares. Like you guys don't know us yet, so it's like why would you care? But if you've liked this episode enough to stick around until the end, maybe this is important to you, and or maybe we told you in the future to check this out, and now you want to. So thank you, future subscriber, if that's the case. But Zach, what would you say is for you why you wanted to do this? Like why it is that we decided to do this?
Because my FI liked it enough to do it.
Yeah, yeah.
I'd say for me because I think this is valuable information if you don't take it too seriously. I think all of this, what we're doing here, is just something that can help people in their own way contextualize themselves and the people around them. Because that's what I use it for. It just provides context. And if you're someone who likes to think about why have I done, why did I and my best friend have the exact same thing happen to us, but we responded completely differently? This is just a way of trying to understand that. So, why do I want to do this? Because I just want people to be more informed about themselves and each other. I think that makes the world a lot easier to navigate. And as an FI lead, I care about the world being easier to navigate. So, I will do what I can, what I think will help for that.
Hell yeah, brother. For me, I would say it's just like a look. It's an intellectual interest of mine, of ours. Whenever Zach and I are hanging out, um, we talk about this stuff a lot. We uh, we basically, if somebody were to hear our conversation and like they didn't know us, it would be like a lot of times I feel like it would be really weird to listen in on. Besides the really inappropriate jokes and all that shit, it would be like we're talking in another language.
I don't know
Um,
how many times I've said to Mauricio things like, "Yeah, that was just a little any I let out." Like that
it's like
means
someone
nothing
would
to
be like, "Dude,
anyone.
what are you talking about?" Um, so I think like I realized like I want to like this is something I want to talk about, and I want to engage with people that also like it.
Hmm.
Because it's something I read about, it's something I like to learn about, and I want to connect with people who are in the same boat. And I'm hoping that I can teach people. I'm hoping that people can teach me, um, and that we can also just like eliminate some stereotypes away from the space. I want this, like Zach, to actually be a helpful tool for people. And I think it can be a helpful tool for people, but I don't think it's a helpful tool in its 16 personalities format. Um, so the big strategy, which I'll say here, is we want to have a wide funnel of people that are into the 16 personality stuff, and we want to funnel them in here so that we can convert them to the real useful frameworks that will actually benefit their lives.
Learn your functions. That's where
Learn
the
your
key
functions.
is.
Your mama told you to eat your vegetables, but she forgot to tell you to know your functions. My kids are gonna know. I'm gonna be like, eat your broccoli and know your functions. It's important, bro. So
At the dinner table, pop quiz. Did I just use extroverted sensing or extroverted intuition just now? You tell
yeah,
me.
yeah, right. No, my kids are gonna hate me, dude. Dude, I'm gonna have so much fun. I'm so excited to be a dad because I'm just gonna like, I'm gonna just like, I know I'm gonna like be at the table. I'm gonna make a statement and I'm gonna be like, disagree with me.
Yeah.
Like, tell me why I'm wrong. Tell me why I'm stupid, and just like kind of see what they think. I don't know. Maybe they'll like it. Maybe they'll hate it. But I think it'll
But
be
they'll get
super
something
fun.
out of it.
They'll get something out of it. Anyways, guys, thank you for watching our first episode. Stay tuned for many more. We'll go in depth through all the types. We're also going to talk to people of different types. We're going to talk to influencers in the space. We're going to dissect people. We're going to have Q&As. We're going to do it all. So for all things MBTI, cognitive functions, we're here. We're here. So please subscribe, and we'll talk to you soon.
Appreciate it. See y'all next time.